I fitted the Dal Soggio Sphere closed cartridges about 20 hours ago, so I've built up a fair amount of riding experience on them now. Initially I had 4.4 Newton per millimeter springs, and I found them all stiff for my weight, which is 80 kilograms. So what I did was I went back to the stock Explore springs, which are 4.2, and I found that they matched my weight a lot better. I also played around with the compression setting. The stock setting is 13, and I backed that out to 21, and I found that that worked for me well in all conditions. The rebound setting I left stock at 12, and I didn't find any issues with that. But even with those settings, even though I liked the ride, I felt I wasn't using up the full amount of travel on the suspension. So what I did was I fitted a zip tie on one fork leg, so I could monitor the amount of travel I'm using. And you can see here, this is after my last ride. I've got about 2 inches of unused travel. So even so, with the settings I'm using, I feel that the suspension setting is a little stiff for the type of riding I'm doing. So I did some reading online and found that other people who are doing similar riding also wanted to soften up their Sphere cartridges, and I found a recommendation for a modified compression shim stack. So I went ahead and ordered the required shims. So this video is going to be how to revalve the compression shim stack. I'm just about to take the fork tubes out, but before I do, I'm going to loosen the fork caps, and you can do that by loosening the top triple clamp bolts. You keep the lower triple clamp bolts tight, and then just loosen the fork cap. Then when you loosen the lower triple clamp bolts, be careful, because these forks actually just slide straight out, as you can see. If you're not careful, it can land on your foot. Before you start disassembling your forks, you want to make sure they're nice and clean, that you've washed them, which is what I've already done. You don't want any dirt getting inside the forks. So I've just loosened off the fork cap, and I'm going to drain out the oil. Once you've drained the oil, you can loosen the fork lower bolt. Once you've fully loosened the lower bolt, you'll need a holding tool. This cap wrench has a handy holding tool built into it. But with the fork in the vise, just pull the fork towards you and then slide the holding tool in. Then using a 15mm open-end wrench and your 17mm hex, you can undo the lower bolt. And then remove it. And now is a good time to remove the rebound adjuster rod. Then once you've removed the lower bolt, you can remove the holder. Then with the lower bolt fully removed, loosen the fork cap off. And then you can lift the cartridge out. Then you want to wipe off any excess oil off the fork. And make sure you're doing this in a nice clean area. Don't want dirt and grit sticking to the fork cartridge. The next step is to remove the compression adjuster. Make sure you know what setting the adjuster is set in if you want to use the same setting. To stop it rotating while you undo it, you can use a pin wrench. This is a 4mm pin wrench. You see 2 pins, and I'm going to use this later to actually take the cap off. But to stop the adjuster rotating while you unscrew it, you can put it in like that and undo it, and then this just lifts off. Then in next step, I want to measure the bladder pressure. So I'm going to remove the cover screw. And there's an O-ring on there, so make sure you don't lose that. And then I purchased this Motion Pro tool, which goes down into the bladder, and I modified it by putting a shrouder valve onto it. So I can use a pressure gauge on here, or when I want to put air back into it, I can easily put a pump onto it. Okay, so I've inserted the tool into the bladder, and I've got my pressure gauge. Right now it's set to PSI. And maybe you can see it's reading 24.1 psi, which is 1.66 bar. Then the next step is to let out all the air from the bladder. So I'm just going to use a valve tool and release the valve. Once you've released the air pressure from inside the bladder, you can remove the compression cap. And again, use the same pin wrench. So this is a 4mm pin wrench. Make sure it's fully inserted. Okay, and that's fully released now. So you can remove the pin wrench, and then with the tray ready, just lift out the bladder. You can see it's partially deflated now. So here you can see more clearly, here's the bladder, and this is the compression shim stack, which is what I want to make some changes to. I'm going to drain out the oil from the inner tube. The next step is to remove the compression valve stack, which is this part. And you need a 13mm open-ended wrench on the lower and a 17 on the top, and then just loosen the top nut. And then the last bit I'm just going to do by hand. And you need to be very careful at this stage to not lose anything, so it's best to use a small screwdriver or a thin tool that you can put down inside, and then slide everything off onto that so you don't lose anything. So it comes off like that, and you know the exact order of everything. So before you start making changes to the shim stack, make sure you have a list of the current shims. So this is the sheet that Dal Soggio provided with my cartridges, and these are the compression shims listed up. And then I printed out the details of the updated shim stack I want to use. Okay, I'm going to lay out all the shims in this long tray. Make sure it's completely clean. So I'm going to lay them out in order. Okay, so I've laid all the shims out in order. This is from the bottom going up to the top, and I've confirmed that it's the right number. They match the sheet that was provided. The next step is to look at the new valving spec and take out the shims that are not required and put in the new ones. And it's good to have a pair of digital calipers handy if you need to check anything, particularly if you mess up the order or something and need to check what they are. Okay, so I've swapped out the required shims for the new specification, and I'm going to start assembling it again. So it's just a reverse order. So I put them back onto this. Again, make sure there's no dirt or hairs or anything that could interfere. You want them completely clean. Okay, so this is the last one, and that's ready for reinstallation. Okay, so I'm going to reinstall the shims carefully, make sure I don't drop any. appear to be on correctly. Okay, I'm going to take the spring off because I want to apply some Loctite. This is Loctite 243, which is a medium strength Loctite, and just a little bit just to hold the nut, and put the spring back on. Make sure you have it the right way around, and then install the nut. And then you want to tighten the nut down to 7 Newton meters. Okay, I'm ready to torque the nut to spec. And that's the compression stack assembly complete. The next step is to refill the inner cartridge with oil, and to do that you need 190 milliliters of fork oil, and I'm using Bel-Ray 5 weight, which is a recommended weight for this fork. And once you've measured out your oil, you can put it back into the inner cartridge. Then to bleed the air out of the cartridge, you need to move the rod in and out slowly. You shouldn't do it fast, or it introduce more air. Just do it very slowly, and I'm probably going to do it about 10 times. Okay, so that feels nice and smooth now. I can't feel any air in there. So I'm going to extend the rod fully. Then you need to check the oil level height, and I've set my oil level gauge to 122 milliliters, and I'm going to draw off the excess oil. Before installing the bladder, if it was collapsed like mine was, you should pump a little bit of air into it so it holds its shape. Also apply some silicone grease to the bladder upper sealing area, and also the O-ring. Okay, so now we're ready to reinstall bladder. Just push it down. And then you need your pin wrench. Okay. And I heard that the new inflation specification is 1.2 bar, so that's what I'm going to inflate it to. I'm going to check the pressure with my digital pressure gauge. And it is 1.21 bar. The next step is to purge any air that might be in the inner cartridge. And the method to do that is clamp it in a vise using soft jaws at 45 degree with the purge valve at the top, and then slowly press in the rod, and I can see a little bit of oil coming out, and that's it. So after I purged the air out of the inner chamber, I found the pressure to be slightly lower, so I added some more air, and I'm doing the final pressure check now. That's 1.25. 1.23. 202. That's 1.2. Then put in the bolt that covers the bladder. Make sure you put the O-ring in, and then the compression adjuster On the compression adjuster, you need to use a little bit of thread lock. So I'm using Loctite 243, which is a medium strength. And that's the assembly of the cartridge complete. Then insert the rebound adjuster rod. Make sure it's fully seated. And then you can install the lower bolt. And the lower bolt needs to be torqued to 18 Newton meters. Then the lower bolt is torqued to 30 Newton meters. Okay, then you need to measure out 340 milliliters of fork oil for the outer tube. Then carefully pour in the 340 milliliters of oil that you measured out. Then torque the fork cap to 40 Newton meters once it's installed in the forks with the lower triple clamp bolt tightened. Before I install the fork tube, I always spray off with some brake cleaner just to get rid of any oil. And that's ready for installation now. So that's the fork revalve complete. I've got a 2-day ride this weekend in the mountains, which I'm really looking forward to. I'll be sure to post some comments after the ride regarding how it performs.